federal agents arrived in the pristine Disney-designed town of Celebration, Florida, expecting to serve a routine warrant for healthcare fraud, a $1 million insurance scam. Instead, they stepped into a waking nightmare. As the door opened, the sweet, cloying scent of advanced decomposition filled the air, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns outside. Anthony Todt stood in the hallway, dazed and clutching a bottle of Benadryl. Behind him, in the master bedroom, lay the mummified remains of his wife, their 3 young children, and the family dog, all wrapped in blankets and left to rot for weeks while Tony continued to live among them. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the carnage in Florida, one must look back to a bedroom in Pennsylvania 40 years earlier. In 1980, the Todt family name first entered the criminal annals when Anthony's father, Robert Todt, a respected special education teacher and wrestling coach, was accused of a cold-blooded assassination plot. Robert was involved in a scandalous affair with one of his former students and sought a permanent exit from his marriage. He hired a man named John Gearhart to enter his home and execute his wife, Loretta, while Robert established an alibi at a local wrestling match. 4-year-old Anthony was in the house when the gunman entered the master bedroom and shot Loretta in the face. Against all odds, she survived the bullet to her head, though the trauma left a permanent scar on the family's psyche. During the subsequent trial, a young Anthony reportedly told investigators that he saw a man in the house, a witness to the violence that his father had orchestrated. Despite Loretta eventually forgiving Robert and even supporting his appeals, the father was convicted of attempted murder and solicitation, serving several years in prison. This warped blueprint of family mercy and domestic violence would eventually resurface in Anthony's own adult life. Anthony sought to build a life that functioned as a rejection of his father's legacy. He became a high achiever, earning a degree in physical therapy and establishing himself as a pillar of the community in Colchester, Connecticut. He was the kind of man who volunteered at his children's schools and was known for his gentle demeanor with patients. He married Megan, a fellow physical therapist and talented yoga instructor whose devotion to her family and her faith was well known among their social circles. Together, they built Family Physical Therapy, a business that seemed from the outside to be a lucrative success. By all accounts, the couple was raising 3 bright, active children, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe. The family was deeply involved in music and sports, seemingly living a life of abundance. However, by the mid-2000s, a hidden decay began to rot the foundations of their prosperity. Megan's health began to fail as she struggled with chronic Lyme disease and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, conditions that caused her significant physical pain and led her to withdraw from her professional duties. As her health declined, Anthony's control over the family's finances and narrative tightened. In an attempt to secure a fresh start and escape the cold Connecticut winters, the family began transitioning to Celebration, Florida, a town specifically designed by the Walt Disney Company to evoke a sense of mid-century American perfection. Celebration was an architectural marvel of nostalgia, where hidden speakers in the bushes played Disney soundtracks and the streets were lined with meticulously curated white picket fences. The Todts moved into a 2-story home on North Shore Drive, paying a monthly rent of $4,800, a figure that Anthony could not afford. While the family enjoyed the Florida sunshine, Anthony was living a frantic double life, commuting back to Connecticut during the week to manage his clinics. Behind the scenes, he was drowning in a sea of predatory debt, having taken out more than 20 merchant cash advances from various lenders. These high-interest loans were draining his accounts faster than he could replenish them. To bridge the gap, Anthony turned to a massive systemic scheme of healthcare fraud. Investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services later discovered that Anthony had misappropriated over $130,000 through fraudulent insurance claims. He was billing Medicaid for therapy sessions that never happened, often claiming he had seen patients on days when the clinic was closed or the patients were not even in the state. He even billed for Megan's services long after her illnesses had made it impossible for her to work. As federal agents began closing in during late 2019, Anthony realized that his Disney-designed utopia was a house of cards. The pressure of the impending legal collapse, combined with his increasingly erratic religious delusions about an upcoming apocalypse and the need for salvation, created a volatile psychological cocktail. He began telling relatives that the family needed to move on to a better place, a statement that was misinterpreted as a simple relocation, but in Anthony's mind, it carried a much darker final meaning. The professional union of Anthony and Megan Todt began in the clinical, sterile hallways of their training in the early 1990s. Both were students of physical therapy, drawn together by a shared ambition to heal and a mutual understanding of the human body's mechanics. In those early years, the relationship was defined by a synchronized drive for upward mobility. They weren't just a couple, they were a burgeoning medical brand. Shortly after their marriage, they established their practice in Connecticut, a venture that relied heavily on Megan's clinical brilliance and Tony's gregarious, high-energy personality. In the affluent suburbs of Colchester, they were viewed as the gold standard of domestic and professional success. Neighbors recalled the couple as inseparable, often seen together at community events or managing the daily operations of their multiple clinics. As their business flourished, the family grew with the arrival of Alec, Tyler, and finally, little Zoe. The children were the center of a carefully curated universe. Alec and Tyler were known in the neighborhood as talented musicians and athletes, while Zoe was the spirited youngest who followed her mother everywhere. Tony took immense pride in his role as the patriarch, often framing his identity around his ability to provide a life of luxury. He wanted his children to have every advantage: private lessons, the best gear, and a home that felt like a sanctuary. Behind the front door, the household was characterized by an intense, almost claustrophobic closeness. Megan, despite her professional background, began to lean more heavily into her role as a homemaker as her health began to deteriorate, leaving the logistical and financial burdens of their empire solely on Tony's shoulders. The shift in their relationship dynamic was subtle at first, anchored in Megan's declining physical state. As the Lyme disease and other autoimmune issues took hold, she transitioned from a vibrant therapist to a woman often confined to her bed by chronic pain. This health crisis acted as a catalyst for a profound shift in the family's spiritual life. No longer finding sufficient answers in traditional medicine, the very field they had dedicated their lives to, the couple began to explore more esoteric and fringe religious concepts. They didn't just attend church, they began to construct a private theology centered on cleansing and salvation. Friends noticed that Megan had become increasingly fixated on the idea of an afterlife, a place where she would finally be free from the prison of her failing body. Tony, ever the provider, adapted to this new reality by becoming her spiritual protector, reinforcing the idea that the world outside was a source of toxicity and corruption. This burgeoning religious obsession created a pressure cooker environment. Tony began to describe the family's future in terms of a transition or a move to a higher plane. He told those close to him that the family needed to be prepared for an upcoming spiritual reckoning, though he always framed these discussions within the context of their shared faith. The move to Celebration, Florida in 2017 was the physical manifestation of this desire to escape. They weren't just moving for the weather, they were moving to a town that promised a controlled, safe reality, a place where the Disney veneer could mask the growing cracks in their foundation. In Celebration, the Todts lived a life that appeared idyllic. They were the family that rode bikes through the wood-plinked trails and attended community festivals. However, the cost of maintaining this illusion was staggering. Tony was essentially supporting two separate lives, the Florida fantasy and the failing Connecticut business. The commute took a heavy toll. He would spend long weeks in Connecticut, staying in a cramped apartment or even at the clinic, only to fly back to Florida on the weekends to play the role of the perfect father. This physical separation increased the insulation of the family unit in Celebration. Since the children were homeschooled and Megan rarely left the house due to her pain, Tony became their only link to the outside world. He was the filter through which all information passed. He managed the mail, the phone calls, and the mounting stack of eviction notices and legal threats that began to accumulate at both their Connecticut and Florida addresses. By 2019, the relationship had entered a dark, codependent phase. Megan's reliance on Tony was absolute, and Tony's need to remain her hero was pathological. He could not bring himself to admit that they were broke, that they were being evicted, or that the FBI was monitoring his bank accounts. Instead of admitting failure, he leaned further into their shared delusions. He reinforced Megan's fears about the darkness of the world and the necessity of staying together as a family at any cost. He told her that he was handling the finances, that everything was fine, and that they would soon be moving to a place where pain no longer existed. This wasn't just a lie to his wife. It was a narrative he was desperately trying to sell to himself. The more the walls of reality closed in, the more the merchant lenders called, and the more the federal agents knocked, the more Tony retreated into the role of the savior who would deliver his family from the coming storm. The Disney town, with its manufactured happiness and scripted perfection, provided the perfect stage for this final tragic performance. The transition from the clinical reality of Connecticut to the manufactured bliss of celebration occurred in the final weeks of December 2019. Anthony arrived at the North Shore Drive residence, carrying the weight of a multi-agency federal investigation and the crushing realization that his financial house of cards had finally collapsed. The Disney lifestyle was no longer a refuge, it had become a trap. According to the timeline later reconstructed by investigators, the cleansing began sometime between December 14th and the Christmas holiday. This was not a sudden explosion of domestic rage, but a slow, methodical progression into madness, a ritualistic exit orchestrated by a man who believed he was the only one capable of saving his family from an impending spiritual and social apocalypse. Tony would later provide varying accounts of who initiated the violence, but the physical evidence painted a picture of a calculated, pharmaceutical-grade execution. He began by preparing what he viewed as a sacrament, massive doses of Benadryl. He told detectives that he and Megan had spent hours discussing the necessity of leaving this world together to reach a higher plane where her physical pain would vanish and the children would be protected from the darkness Tony saw closing in. He described a household thick with religious fervor and the scent of incense, where the line between reality and delusion had completely dissolved. The first to be cleaved from the world was the youngest, Zoe. Tony recounted how he sat on her bed while she slept, holding her hand. He described the process of ensuring she had consumed enough of the sedative to be unconscious before he proceeded. He told investigators that he used his own weight to suffocate her, claiming that he wanted her passing to be as peaceful as possible. He spoke of it not as a murder, but as a release. After her breath stopped, he moved her small body to the master bedroom, placing her on the bed that would eventually become a communal altar for the entire family. Next were the boys, Alec and Tyler. The atmosphere in the house had become increasingly heavy, yet Tony maintained a calm, paternal mask. He approached his sons under the guise of a nighttime ritual. He would later claim that Megan was present, watching, and even assisting, though forensic experts would find no evidence to support her active participation in the physical acts of violence. Tony described the struggle with the older boys, how their youthful strength required more than just the sedative. He admitted to using a knife, a detail that stood in grim contrast to his narrative of peaceful passage. He told detectives that he stabbed them to ensure they would not wake up in the darkness. The clinical precision of a physical therapist was used here to find the most efficient path to death. Alec was found with a stab wound to the abdomen. Tyler had been handled with similar finality. He described the boys' confusion in their final moments, yet he framed their deaths as a necessary mercy, a way to keep the family unit unbroken. Megan was the final human life to be extinguished. Tony's account of her death was the most convoluted, shifting between claims of a suicide pact and a mercy killing. He described how they lay together on the bed, surrounded by their children. He told investigators that she was in a state of religious ecstasy, eager to join Zoe, Alec, and Tyler. He claimed he stabbed her at her own request, a claim that the medical examiner would later view with extreme skepticism given the nature of the wounds. Once Megan was dead, Tony turned his attention to the final member of the household, Breezy, the family's loyal dog. He told detectives that Breezy had to go with them, as no one could be left behind in the toxic world. He described the act of killing the dog with the same detached, ritualistic tone he used for his children. What followed was perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the entire case: the weeks of silence. For the remainder of December and the first 13 days of January, Anthony Todt lived in the house with the remains of his family. He did not flee. He did not call for help. Instead, he maintained a macabre domesticity. He told investigators that he spent those weeks praying, waiting for the apocalypse he believed was imminent and preparing himself to join them. He kept the air conditioning at the North Shore Drive house set to a low, bone-chilling temperature in a futile attempt to slow the inevitable process of decay. He lived in the kitchen and the living room, occasionally venturing into the master bedroom to sit with the bodies, which he had carefully wrapped in blankets. He described the peace he felt in the house, even as the biological reality of 5 decomposing bodies began to permeate the walls. During this period, Tony continued to interact with the outside world via his cell phone. He sent texts to relatives in Connecticut, crafting a narrative that the family was sick with the flu and needed privacy to recover. He used Megan's phone to send messages, miming her voice to reassure her worried mother and siblings. He spoke of the family moving on and going to a better place, phrases that were interpreted by his family as plans for a new home, but which Tony intended as a literal description of their state. He watched from the windows as the Disney-designed Christmas festivals took place just blocks away. The artificial snow falling on Market Street, the carolers, the families in matching sweaters, while he sat in the dark, cold interior of a house that had become a tomb. He told detectives that he viewed the outside world as a hologram of sin, and that he had successfully moved his family into the real world through his actions. As the calendar turned to 2020, the physical reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The smell, described by later responders as a physical weight, began to seep through the vents. Tony became increasingly dazed, consuming Benadryl in what he claimed were multiple attempts to take his own life. He told investigators that the timing wasn't right, or that he was being held back by a spiritual force. He existed in a state of high-functioning catatonia, managing to answer the door when a landlord's representative came by, yet failing to acknowledge the horror just a few feet away. He had constructed a world where he was the hero of a tragedy, a man who had sacrificed everything to keep his family together in the afterlife. The Disney town of celebration, with its emphasis on happily ever after, had provided the perfect, ironic backdrop for a man who had decided that the only way to achieve that happiness was through the total annihilation of his own bloodline. While the interior of the North Shore Drive residence remained frozen in a refrigerated, silent stasis, the world outside began to vibrate with a mounting, frantic energy. The first fractures in Anthony's narrative appeared not in the manufactured perfection of Florida, but in the tight-knit communities of Connecticut. Relatives who were used to a constant stream of photos, holiday plans, and boisterous phone calls from the Todt children suddenly found themselves met with a wall of digital noise. Messages sent to Megan's phone were returned with uncharacteristic brevity. The responses claimed the entire household had been leveled by a brutal strain of the flu, that the kids were constantly sleeping, that Megan was too exhausted to even hold the device to her ear. By late December, the silence had become a physical weight for Megan's family. Her sister, remaining in the Northeast, grew increasingly unsettled by the lack of a traditional Christmas morning greeting. It was a digital ghost town. When relatives pressed for a phone call, Anthony, using Megan's accounts, replied that the family needed total isolation to recover. He painted a picture of a house in recovery, while in reality, he was the only living soul moving through the darkened rooms. This period of digital kidnapping allowed Anthony to buy nearly a month of time, but it also sowed the seeds of suspicion that would eventually lead to the front door. In celebration, the neighbors began to notice the subtle signs of a house that had died while its lights were still on. The North Shore Drive neighborhood was one where the absence of a trash can on pickup day or a lawn slightly overgrown was a point of discussion. People noticed that the Todt family's bicycle rides had ceased. The blinds remained tightly drawn, even on the brightest Florida afternoons. Some residents later recalled thinking the family had simply moved back north without saying goodbye. a common occurrence in a town where many properties served as seasonal retreats. Yet the black SUV remained in the driveway, a silent, unmoving sentinel that suggested someone was still there. The first formal intervention occurred on December 29th. Concerned relatives in Connecticut had finally contacted the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, requesting a welfare check. A deputy arrived at the manicured lawn, walked up the steps, and knocked. There was no answer. He peered through the windows, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no chaos. He noted that the house was quiet and reported back that it appeared the family was simply away. It was a standard procedure, a no-contact result that happens dozens of times a day in law enforcement, but in this instance, it was a catastrophic missed opportunity. As the calendar flipped to January 2020, the pressure from the north intensified. Megan's family was no longer accepting the flu excuse. They began reaching out to local celebration Facebook groups, asking if anyone had seen the children. At the same time, the landlord of the North Shore Drive property was dealing with his own growing frustration. The Todts were months behind on rent, and an eviction notice had already been filed. A representative for the landlord visited the house in early January. He later described the eerie sensation of standing on the porch, noticing a faint, unpleasant odor that he initially attributed to a backed-up sewer line or a dead rodent in the crawl space. He knocked, but the only response was the deep, heavy silence of the Disney-designed interior. The search for the Todt family was never a traditional manhunt or a missing persons case with flyers on every pole. It was a slow-motion collision between two separate worlds, the family's personal concern and the federal government's professional pursuit. While the deputies in Florida were treating the situation as a routine welfare check, federal agents from the Department of Health and Human Services and the FBI were finalizing their case against Anthony for healthcare fraud. They weren't looking for a killer. They were looking for a man who had stolen over $100,000 from the state. On January 9th, another welfare check was requested. Again, deputies arrived at the house. This time, they noticed that the air conditioning was running at an extremely high intensity for a winter month, even by Florida standards. They knocked, they walked the perimeter, they checked the doors and found them locked. Because there was no immediate evidence of a crime, no exigent circumstances, the officers lacked the legal authority to kick in the door. They left a business card in the doorframe and drove away. Inside, Anthony sat in the cold, watching the shadow of the patrol car disappear from the driveway. He would later tell investigators that he viewed these visits as tests of his faith, believing that if the world was truly ending, the authorities would have no power to find him. The tension reached its breaking point on the morning of January 13th, 2020. The federal agents arrived with a warrant for Anthony's arrest. They were accompanied by local deputies, prepared to finally put an end to the fraud investigation. When they approached the house, they noticed the business card from the previous visit was still wedged in the door. The smell, which had been a faint nuisance weeks prior, was now an undeniable, sickly sweet wall of scent that permeated the porch. As they forced entry, they didn't find a fleeing suspect. They found a man who appeared to have aged decades in a matter of weeks. Anthony was staggering, his speech slurred from the massive amounts of Benadryl he had ingested. He was clutching a bottle of the sedative like a talisman. When agents asked where his family was, he gestured toward the stairs with a vacant, hollow stare. The agents ascended to the master bedroom, expecting perhaps to find a family hiding from the law. Instead, they stepped into a tomb. The cold air from the maxed-out AC unit hit them first, followed by the sight of the blankets. The search had ended, but the true horror was just beginning. The agents realized that for nearly 4 weeks, while they were filing paperwork and tracking bank accounts, a father had been living, eating, and sleeping in a house with the mummified remains of everyone he claimed to love. The community of celebration, built on the promise of a perfect life, woke up that morning to find that its white picket fences had been shielding a darkness that Disney's architects could never have imagined. The clinical investigation into the deaths of the Todt family began in a house chilled to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature maintained by a man who had spent weeks watching the physical evidence of his crimes slowly succumb to biology. As forensic teams moved through the North Shore Drive residence, they were met with a scene that defied the standard logic of domestic homicide. There were no signs of a struggle in the common areas, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. The carnage was contained entirely within the master bedroom. The initial reports from the scene described the victims as being in various stages of decomposition, wrapped carefully in blankets and placed with a ritualistic intent that suggested a mind untethered from reality. Detectives focused first on the missed opportunities that had allowed Anthony to remain in the house for so long. They scrutinized the logs of the December 29th and January 2nd welfare checks. In both instances, deputies had reported a quiet house with no visible distress. The red herring that had effectively paralyzed the initial response was Anthony's digital manipulation. He had successfully convinced relatives in Connecticut that the family was incapacitated by a severe flu, using the children's and Megan's phones to send reassurances that were just vague enough to buy him time. This digital ghosting created a barrier of privacy that the Fourth Amendment protected, until the federal warrant for healthcare fraud provided the legal key to the front door. The interrogation of Anthony Todt began at a nearby hospital, where he was being treated for a Benadryl overdose. Even in a state of pharmaceutical-induced lethargy, he began to weave a narrative of spiritual necessity. He told the investigators that the plan had been a joint decision between him and Megan, that she had become obsessed with the idea of cleansing their souls to prepare for a coming apocalypse. He claimed that Megan had initiated the violence, even suggesting she was the one who had stabbed the boys. He spoke of their deaths not as a loss, but as a relocation. He described the process of cleansing each child, claiming it was done out of a profound, twisted love. However, as the detectives pressed for specifics, the why became increasingly tied to the how much. Parallel to the homicide investigation, federal agents from the Department of Health and Human Services were dismantling Anthony's professional life. The midpoint pivot in the investigation occurred when detectives realized that the religious delusions were inextricably linked to a massive, looming financial collapse. Anthony's clinic, Family Physical Therapy, was a shell. Investigators discovered that he had taken out over 20 merchant cash advances, predatory loans often referred to as legalized loan sharking. The interest rates were astronomical, and Anthony had been funneling fraudulent Medicaid payments directly into these debts. He was caught in a cycle of billing for patients who had never stepped foot in his clinic, or patients he claimed to have seen while he was actually hundreds of miles away in Florida. The federal agents had been tracking him for months, unaware that as they built their case for fraud, Anthony was building a tomb. The medical examiner's findings provided the final, objective contradiction to Anthony's shifting stories. The autopsy reports for Alec, Tyler, and Zoe revealed high concentrations of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, in their systems. This confirmed that they had been incapacitated before the physical trauma occurred. The presence of stab wounds on the boys and Megan suggested a level of violence that Anthony had attempted to sanitize in his early confessions. The most damning evidence against his claim that Megan was the primary actor was the physical logistics of the crimes. Megan's debilitating physical condition made it highly unlikely she could have carried out the suffocation and stabbing of two athletic teenage boys. The forensic reconstruction indicated that Anthony was the only individual with the physical strength and mental focus to execute the plan. As detectives dug into Anthony's personal history, they found the echoes of his father's 1980 conviction for attempted murder. They looked for a blueprint of violence that might explain his descent. They discovered that Anthony had been telling people for months that he had visions and that the family needed to be prepared to cross over. He had meticulously researched the effects of various sedatives and had spent the final weeks of 2019 isolating his family from any external support. Neighbors who were questioned revealed that Anthony had become increasingly erratic, speaking about the corruption of the outside world and the need to protect his children's purity. The investigation also touched upon the psychological state of the victims. Evidence suggested that the children were entirely unaware of their father's financial crimes or the impending eviction. They were living in a manufactured Disney paradise, trusting the man who claimed to be their protector. The discovery of Zoe's body, the youngest and most vulnerable, sent a ripple of visceral horror through the Osceola County Sheriff's Office. She had been dead for weeks, kept in a bed with her brothers, while her father sat in the next room. This wasn't just a murder, it was a total psychological surrender. Anthony had decided that if he could not be the successful provider he had promised to be, he would instead be the savior who took his family into a world where debts and federal agents could no longer reach them. By the time the formal charges were being prepared, the community of Celebration was in a state of shock. The investigators noted the change in the local atmosphere. The white picket fences and manicured lawns now felt like the walls of a high-security prison. The Disney town had failed to protect its most innocent residents from a man who wore the mask of a devoted father. Every detail of the investigation, from the high-interest loans in Connecticut to the refrigerated air on North Shore Drive, pointed to a singular, terrifying conclusion. Anthony Todt had calculated the value of his family's lives and decided that their deaths were the only way to balance his books. In April 2022, after years of pandemic delays and psychological evaluations, Anthony Todt finally stood before a jury in Osceola County. The man who arrived in court was a shadow of the energetic physical therapist relatives remembered. He looked diminished, his face etched with the weight of 2 years in isolation. The prosecution's case was a clinical dismantling of his spiritual transition defense. They presented the physical evidence of the stab wounds and the toxic levels of diphenhydramine found in the children, shattering the narrative of a peaceful passing. Anthony took the stand in his own defense, a move that legal experts viewed as a final, desperate attempt to control the story. He told the court that he had returned home to find Megan in a trance-like state, claiming she had already released the children to save them from a perceived darkness. He described a scene where he merely assisted in her final moments out of a twisted sense of loyalty. However, the medical examiner testified that the logistics were impossible. Megan's physical state was too weak to carry out such systematic violence. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty, as the word guilty echoed through the silent courtroom. Anthony showed no visible emotion. During sentencing, the judge's words were sharp, describing him as a destroyer of worlds who had wiped out generations of potential. The final judgment was absolute: 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Anthony was led away, destined to spend the rest of his life in the very state-mandated confinement he had killed to avoid, leaving the community of Celebration to begin the slow process of reclaiming its peace. Celebration remains an architectural ideal of mid-century nostalgia, but the silence at the house on North Shore Drive serves as a permanent puncture in that Disney dream. Anthony Todt is now confined to a state-mandated cell, the cold, physical reality he tried to escape through the total annihilation of his family. For those who walk these manicured streets, the white picket fences no longer represent a sanctuary. They serve as a grim reminder that the greatest darkness often hides behind the most polished masks, and that in a town designed for happy endings, some stories can never be redeemed. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.